That is just shocking because, can you remind us, myself and the listeners, as to when GM crops were introduced into the United States in large measure?
Well, it started in 1996. That was with soy and corn and some cotton for cottonseed oil, and then a little bit of canola, which came in big force the following year. Now, someone showed me some documentation and found that there were lower birth weight babies that started in mid 1990s that have been increasing since then. So there's a coincidence, perhaps, we don't know. But there's also an increase in infertility as well as infant mortality. I think the United States has the only 47th in the world in terms of infant mortality. So we have a high level of babies that are dying, and we don't know if genetic modified foods are related.
Well, and that was present prior to the introduction of GM crops. I mean, the United States system has been deteriorating for quite a large number of years, and a major collapse occurred in the mid-'70s when they figured out how to make high fructose corn syrup, and that was the beginning of the end for a lot of metabolic processes.
Right, and also the infertility was also on the increase, and it was increasing, but it also increased more since GMO crops were introduced. But again, here we're speculating because no one is actually monitoring the population to see if GMOs are causing these health problems. In Canada, the Canadian version of the FDA, Health Canada, announced in 2002 that they would monitor the health of Canadians to see if GMOs were causing problems, but within a year they gave up the study saying it was too difficult.
So I guess the point of going down the road of trying to figure out the timing is that this new study shows clearly this, many of the most significant side effects are not occurring in the groups who are actually consuming the genetically modified foods. It's actually in the subsequent generations, their offspring, and then even worse yet, the offspring of their offspring. So the grandchildren. And we certainly have not gotten to the grandchild phase. I mean, certainly we're in the first generation in a few cases, but we certainly haven't even begun to hit the second generation because these things were only introduced 15 years ago.
And I asked the biologist, Alexei Surov, the main scientist from the cancer study, what he thinks about eating GMOs, and his opinion was we shouldn't wait till the studies are done. He says we have no right to use GMOs until we understand the possible adverse effects, not only to ourselves, but as you said, to future generations as well. We definitely need fully detailed studies to clarify this. Any type of contamination has to be tested before we consume it, and GMO is just one of them. So he is strong, even though he said he needs to continue to evaluate his samples. He's collected blood samples, and he wants to analyze hormone levels. He's trying to raise funds for that. He's collected the documentation of the size of the testes, spleen, uterus, etc., and other organs that'll be evaluated. But he said, we don't know if it's the genetic modification. We don't know if it's the extra herbicides. We don't know if there's some contamination. He wants to be clear, but he's saying we shouldn't wait until we have the details before avoiding GMOs. There's just no justification for having them in the diet.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Anyone who is rational and would take a prudent approach, it would seem more than wise to implement the precautionary principle. And in fact, that's what's been implemented in Europe for the most part. But in this country, and maybe you can update us as to where we are, there's been massive corporate influences that have essentially limited or prevented the application of the precautionary principle in this country, and as a result, they're amassing putting together massive amount of profits for the result of implementing these technologies, and it's a short-term profit. I mean, they're gaining their money, but they're using it it's coming at a price, and the price is not even necessarily people are consuming it, but their descendants. So I'm wondering if you can update us as to where we're at with respect to limiting the use of GM crops in the United States.
Well, unfortunately, the Obama administration has not been forthcoming with his personal campaign promise to label GMOs. He has placed the person in charge of U.S. food safety, Michael Taylor, the U.S. food safety czar. He was Monsanto's former attorney, then became the person in charge of policy at the FDA when the GMO policy was being created in 1992, and basically waved GMOs onto the market without any labeling, without any required testing, and the policy that he oversaw lied, claiming that the agency wasn't aware of information showing that GMOs were different, when in fact it was the overwhelming consensus among the scientists at the FDA, and they were very concerned and they were ignored. So then Michael Taylor became Monsanto's vice president, and now he's in charge of U.S. food safety. And so I would say that the government is not in a position right now to make reasonable and responsible decisions related to GMOs, but we have an amazing momentum now to drive GMOs out of the market through consumer concern. Now, I'm going to tell you something more about some studies to make that concern even more pronounced, because I don't want to give the listeners the impression that this hamster study is some isolated study with no support. Mm-hmm. We have a whole list of problems, reproductive problems, linked to GMOs, and one of the most dramatic also occurred in Russia. In 2005, in October, Dr. Irina Mercola, who's a senior scientist at the Russian National Academy of Sciences, reported that more than half of the babies from mother rats that were fed genetically modified soy died within 3 weeks. That was compared to only a 10% death rate among the controls. Now, we just heard that 5 times the number of hamsters died in terms of the babies that were born, and here 5 times the number of rats died, also in a GM soy experiment. And we also heard that the hamsters were growing more slowly. Well, among the rats from a Mercola study, the size of the rat offspring was much less on average than the control groups. And when they tried to mate the offspring of the rats from the GM soy-fed group, they could not reproduce. So there was a infertility or sterility in the offspring after one generation in the rats, which we were seeing in the second and third generation in the hamsters. Now, just like the current study with the hamsters, Mercola had wanted to do an analysis of the organs that she had preserved and all this, and she said to the scientific community, please provide us some financial support so we can do further investigations. Please repeat this study so we can verify whether it in fact is accurate. Well, no one has repeated it. She didn't actually get more money. In fact, she told me as we were sitting at the EU Parliament after giving a presentation there that her boss had been pressured by his boss, and so she was told to do no more GM food study on animals. The documents were burnt on her desk, samples were stolen from her laboratory, and one of her colleagues tried to comfort her by saying, well, maybe the GM soy will solve the overpopulation problem on Earth. She wasn't impressed. Now, what happened was she's been vilified and attacked by the biotech industry, but there's been one criticism which is actually valid, and that is she didn't do a biochemical analysis of the feed to see if there was some potential toxin that had worked its way into the feed that was responsible for these astounding results. But after doing the study 3 times with similar results, she found coincidentally that the rat chow, which was being fed to all of the rats in the facility, switched so it became based on genetically modified soy. So she couldn't do any more studies because she had no more controls. But she had a brilliant idea. After 2 months, she asked all of her colleagues, what's the infant mortality in your studies? They weren't doing GM studies, at least they didn't know they were, but they were feeding all of their rats genetically modified soy. And it had skyrocketed. The infant mortality had skyrocketed to over 55%, suggesting it wasn't a particular toxin in her bats, but it was a generic problem with GM soy.
And where was her research done? What university?
It was National Academy of Sciences laboratory in Moscow.
Okay, excellent.
Now, when we were in the EU Parliament, she gave me a slide of a completely new study which she fed male rats genetically modified soy, and it's absolutely stunning. On the left side of the slide is a pink testicle. On the right side of the slide is a blue testicle. She said when the GM soy was fed to the male rats, it changed the color of their testicles from pink to blue, and you could see the cells on another slide, left to right. The structure of the cells in the testicle was different, a completely